Hello, and welcome to the September General Meeting of the League of Women Voters of Champaign County. This year we took a look at our existing program and some of the issues going on at a state and national level, and we decided that we would try to focus on having conversations about issues that we see coming up at the national level, but that have relevancy for Champaign County. And so our first meeting this month, we're going to focus on gun violence. There have been issues with gun violence in Champaign County over the last few years, and we're going to talk about some of the things that were done to attempt to ameliorate the situation, where they stand, and we're going to go from here. And I have a panel to help me with that. We will be rebroadcast on the Parkland channel if you would wish to see this later, or if you know someone who's missed it who you would like to see it later. There's also information in the back of the room if you would like to pick up some of that later. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Each of our panelists will have a chance to talk a little bit about their organization and what they do and where they see things stand right now. So to begin, Mr. Tracy Parsons with Community Coalition and CU Fresh Start. Sir?
Okay, thank you. So actually, we're a team today, and we will both speak together as part of the presentation around. In
that case, I'm going to go ahead and introduce
all right.
Deputy Chief Joe Gallo, who's here with us today.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So as I shared, we're going to talk with you about some work we've been doing over the past couple of years, not only to address our gun violence issue, but how we help build more collaborative work amongst community organizations, with a strong focus around police-community relations. And so, again, we're going to combine the work of the coalition and some initiatives that we've taken on to address our gun violence issue, as well as help build some collaborative work in our community. So I am Tracy Parsons. I am the Community Relations Manager for the City of Champaign. We have a fantastic community. I talk about often as I travel around the state, as I travel around the country, to talk about community engagement, community involvement. I find very few that are parallel in our peers. And so I've got a long history of doing community work in our community. I've been working through a number of organizations for 20 plus years. On some levels, we're doing a lot of the same things. So it's important that we talk about our progress, and in some ways it seems like we're having some of the same discussions. And I think it's probably been a number of years, but one of the organizations I worked at, I think we did some voter work with the League of Women Voters. So obviously you're a well-respected historical organization in our community and has a very important role. So thank you for what you do to help address some of our important issues in the community as well. And obviously voting is one of the key that I connect with the League of Women Voters. All right, so the Community Coalition is an organization that developed in 2012 with a couple of years of community work before we actually formed the coalition. So obviously it's hard to watch nightly news and not see across the country issues around police-community relations, unrest in communities across the country. We've seen it playing out in St. Louis in a real direct way right now in the moment, but there's been communities across the country where this has been the occurrence. And unfortunately, we were one of those communities a number of years ago as well. We had an officer-involved shooting that stretched and stressed our community challenges around police-community relations. We had a number of, again, the community unrest, anger, frustration was right here in our community. But what I like to talk about in the positive, constructive way is how we responded as a community. So we had the potential for, relationships to break down, relationships to sever, but our community didn't respond that way. And we went into action in a constructive way with community involvement, law enforcement, our city leadership, all sitting down to talk about how we address this issue of police-community relations, how we address community concerns, how we address law enforcement concerns, how do we get ourselves in the same room to have the conversations together, because that's how you solve these challenges. You know, when people go and draw the lines in the sand and make determinations that they're not going to work with and support, or we're going to be antagonists with each other, not very much gets solved, right? And so our community came together in a new and different way. We had a number of community meetings, discussions, conversations about police-community relations. How do we strengthen them? How do we engage with one another? How do we talk to one another? And so we had, again, a number of community forums. We had over 400 community members come out to the one big one that we had at one of the local hotels. And we broke down into small groups to have conversations. We had a series of questions that the participants were able to answer. So to make a long story short, what came out of that is that we don't have a process to really facilitate conversations as a community, and specifically around police-community relations. And so out of that came our discussions, our groups, and we formed what we call our community coalition. And so we started a small group of us meeting, determining an agenda, a focus, and 5 years later, we have a robust organization that really is one of the premier in the state as it relates to communities, working collaboratively with law enforcement and community. So we formed a group that meets monthly. We meet the second Wednesday of the month, 3:30 at Champaign Public Library. These are open meetings to the public. Our law enforcement leadership is there every month where we have opportunities to talk about community challenges, community issues. People are able to ask questions of law enforcement leadership about things that are going on, questions, what's happening in the neighborhoods, what's happening in the community. So this is county-wide. We have our community coalition meetings and community coalition group. So the community coalition is a collaborative initiative involving government parties, park districts, education, law enforcement, mental health, community organizations, individuals in the community really interested in working on issues of mutual concern. So I stress that because it's in my 20+ years of working in the community, I don't remember a group where you had all of those partners at the table working with one another. Again, you know, these are not easy subjects, not easy topics. And when we started our meetings, Joe, we'd have 6, 7, 10 people. You know, and again, today we have between 80 and 100 folks coming out every month, you know, to talk about these issues. Okay, so I've got on the screen just for you to see just an idea of what that room looks like at Champaign Public Library. We've formed an executive committee that has leadership from each one of the entities that I mentioned. So the superintendents, the police chiefs, heads of the parks, university leadership, parkland leadership, city government leadership, monthly, again, we meet as an executive committee to talk about focus, agenda. Each one of the organizations are financial contributors, so everyone puts in $5,000 to help with organizational issues, allows us to address specific issues as they arise. And it really is a county-wide collaborative approach. Primarily, though, the Champaign and Urbana are the lion's share communities where the engagement is taking place, but obviously we've done a number of things in Rantoul as well. So each year, for the past couple of years, we, as an executive committee, we meet in December. We kind of do an evaluation of the year before, activities, what we've done, what we've accomplished. And then we, in January, meet as a community-wide group. And we put on the boards topics, issues to address. And so we establish our priorities each year that we're going to work on as an organization, as a group, and collaboratively, which is the real key. So this year, in 2017, our priorities are, one is police community relations, the core of what brought us together. So that's really key to our group. And I say each month how fortunate and blessed we are as a community that our law enforcement leadership has made this commitment. And so as I, again, travel across the state and I travel across the country talking about these issues, the first question I always get when I talk about our coalition is, how do you get the law enforcement folks to the table? How do you get them to commit to doing this? And again, as you see these things play out on nightly news, the first thing that you hear is that most local law enforcement and community don't talk with one another. They don't engage with one another. And so communities across the country, as well as the state, are trying to figure out how we do that. We've really mastered that here as a community. We look at community engagement. And so what we mean by that is, again, what can we do together as a community to address some of our tough social and economic issues? So you might have heard of something called Walk as One. So one of the things as we start talking to the community, they said, well, you guys in your governmental bodies and issues, you need to get out into the neighborhoods and hear more from the residents and hear from the constituents what their concerns and what their issues are. So we started doing, so quarterly, we go out, we pick different neighborhoods across the community to go out, we pass out information. Last week, you might have seen or heard that United Way led our walk, and we picked a neighborhood in Champaign and one in Urbana where we went out and passed out information about getting kids ready for kindergarten. And that was our focus for this walk. We've been showing the film Racial Taboo over the last year and a half. This is a film that helps facilitate conversations around the subject of race. So we've had over 1,400 community members see this film in the last year and a half to start having those tough conversations around race. How do we learn better from one another? How do we grow as a community around this tough subject? So community engagement is an important part of work that we do, and those are just a couple of the examples of things that we're doing. Obviously, most of this work revolves around youth. So how can we create as much constructive, collaborative work to engage youth so that we don't have as much free time for youth to make those stupid youthful decisions that can have long-term impact on them. And so we've been raising money. The Mental Health Board has been a fantastic contributor to help us do special initiatives around our youth population and for our youth population. And so the new area, which brings me to a long about way to get to our subject of our community violence. And so over the past really three and a half years, we have seen an unprecedented level of community violence, shootings, gun-involved incidents. And it really has become a main priority for the Community Coalition. I will also say it's been a fantastic engagement tool. So what I mean by that is the first couple of years with the coalition, we really struggled to gain synergy, gain connection. What's going to be our focus? What are the really hot topic issues? What are the things that we want to address? The violence has really enabled us to find that unifying topic and subject that we all can agree that this level of violence is unacceptable. It's something that I always say when I speak and talk about, police can't arrest their way out of this topic and subject. So it really is a community-wide issue that can only be addressed as a community. So law enforcement working with community, with local residents, working with our service organizations, all of us working together, our faith communities, all of us working together to address our community violence issue. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleague here, Joe, to let him share a little bit about the coalition, then we'll come back and talk about specifically our gun violence initiative.
Yeah, as Tracy mentioned, improving police-community relationships is critical for law enforcement, not only here locally in Champaign-Urbana, but across the state and nation. So when the coalition formed officially back in 2012, improving police-community relationships was one of the primary goals. There were 4 goals, and this was one of them that we were addressing. And as Tracy mentioned, there were a lot of meetings, feedback from the community, of community forum back in 2010, where we met with over 350 community members, seeking how we could improve relationships and what steps we could take to do that. One of the common things that we looked at when we were pouring through that information was increasing communication, explaining why we do things the way we do, or if there's a problem in a certain neighborhood. Something as simple as if you're going to increase patrols or increase law enforcement activity in a given neighborhood, share that information with the neighborhood and explain why, so we can get some buy-in from those neighborhoods. And that's something that we've certainly embraced at the Champaign Police Department. But what we know is by meeting with our community members and having a dialogue, the monthly meetings have been really critical as far as being able to share problems and challenges that are facing our community that we're dealing with. When we talk about gun violence, and using our partnerships with the community, we go back to 2013 when we really started seeing an increase in gun violence. In June of 2013, there was one weekend alone where we had 6 individuals that were struck by gunfire. And on Sunday of that weekend, we called together members of the coalition, some community members, and we started talking about that. And that was through the relationships that we were building at the coalition. And this is why police community relationships are so important. So when we met on that Sunday, we started talking about steps that we could take, not only through law enforcement, as Tracy said, we can't arrest ourselves out of that situation. So it was really good to get feedback, input, and a plan with community members on how we could better address gun violence. And that was really kind of the starting point where we started talking about what we can do better as a community, not just a police department, not just law enforcement, but what we could do as a community to address gun violence. I know myself, and I can't speak for the other law enforcement agencies, it was really that weekend in June of 2013 where I didn't feel like it was just a police problem anymore, and it was more of a community response. So that's how important community relationships can be when you have those strong partnerships with organizations and individuals. So talking about the monthly meetings that we have, as Tracy mentioned, they started very small when we first began, and over the years they have grown. Sometimes standing room only, where we're getting more chairs out, which is always encouraging people to come and give feedback and input. But it's really given us an opportunity as a police department, not just the Champaign Police Department, but the Urbana Police Department, University of Illinois Police Department, the Champaign County Sheriff's Office, Parkland College Police Department. They show up as well, and each of the chiefs are given an opportunity to talk and address the audience and talk about challenges, whether it's an increase in burglaries, which has been a hot topic here recently, or an update on gun violence, which is provided each month on what we're doing. But it could be something about how we respond to officer-involved shootings. There could be information about how we're implementing body cameras, just a wide variety of topics that are covered. But it's also an opportunity for the community to be heard if they have questions or want to provide input. So it's a two-way dialogue, and I think that's what's really important, is allowing people and community members to be heard. I know we're going to talk about the Fresh Start Initiative, but through those conversations, through those dialogues, trying to seek a better solution with our community, that's what led to us doing some research with our partners and starting the process of the Fresh Start Initiative that Trace will talk about further.
Yeah. So thanks, Joe. And so again, as we started to see our uptick in gun violence, we were meeting to talk about what should we do? How can we address this, again, community-wide? And so law enforcement was able to find out about an approach to addressing gun violence. And the philosophy was developed by a gentleman by the name of David Kennedy, and the name of his book was called Don't Shoot. So there was a statewide conference around policing and community violence that we had almost 20 individuals from our community go over to this conference in Peoria. This was in November of 15, right? And we went over as a community to learn more about this approach. This approach has several key components that we really bought into and thought could be helpful for our community. One is that law enforcement, the community, and then those that provide services to this population, those that work on this issue, all form a team to address this issue. So we've developed a leadership team that consists of law enforcement, community members, our faith community, service providers, government, and we began to develop this approach, develop a plan of action off of the Don't Shoot concept, which looks at what's called a focused deterrent. So what that means is, from the law enforcement side, they are looking at those individuals who are most likely to be involved in gun violence. So they look at history, they look at group association. I probably should let you talk about, those strategies from the law enforcement side. But we have law enforcement providing that level of leadership. We also have the community side that can talk to the compassion of many of these individuals who've not had success in their life. They struggle with structured discipline, decision-making, all of those types of things, as well as coming with a focused approach. And so for the last really year and a half, we've been working to put our project together. We call it CU Fresh Start, Champaign-Urbana Fresh Start. So the key piece with Fresh Start is that, again, we identify those individuals who we believe are most likely to be in gun violence, and we bring them in to us as a community. So that's called a call-in. So we've had 2 of those call-ins. We have 20 individuals that were selected through a process that we've brought in to talk to them about gun violence, their activity. Now, the real key with this project is we are going to these guys, offering them an opportunity to change their course of action, activity, associations, and all of those types of things. And we will work with them to help them chart a different course. And so for those that choose to work with us, we want to work with them. But for those that choose not to, we want them to know that their activities are no longer acceptable, and we're going to do everything we can as a community to let them know that they have to stop or go. And so that could mean jail, that could mean a number of other ways, but we want to stop that. So Joe, maybe why don't you talk a little bit about what you guys have put together with Street Crimes Task Force, as well as how the Fresh Start piece connects for law enforcement.
Yeah, so around 2015, when we were researching what other communities were doing, we made a visit to Peoria Police Department, and they had a Don't Shoot version that they were getting success with. So we started looking at some of the things they were doing, and they had a street crimes task force that was solely focused on gun violence. And that's something that we brought back to our department, and we started looking at our resources and how we could shift some resources internally to address gun violence. But the nice thing we have here in the Champaign-Urbana community is we have a very close working relationship with our law enforcement partners. So it wasn't just a Champaign issue or an Urbana issue. Really, a few people, especially criminals, care when they cross Wright Street. So whether they're seeking violence in Champaign-Urbana, it impacts both communities and both police departments. So we started looking at how we could leverage our resources together. So we formed, we started kind of a pilot program, putting together officers from each of the jurisdictions, and we had a street crimes task force. Each of the agencies contributed membership, and we started off as a pilot program, and we formalized that into a long-term unit, which is still currently in place. And what those officers do is they follow up on each of the shootings. They obviously are looking at who's involved, what's causing those conflicts, and what steps we can take to dispel the conflicts, but at the same time, holding those individuals accountable that are shooting. And as Tracy mentioned, at the call-ins, the individuals that are spoken to, they are given the opportunity to change their ways, but they're delivered a very clear message that if they do not, the full weight of law enforcement will be focused on them. And that's something that unfortunately, when some of these shootings have occurred, has happened with swift and immediate action and arrests in some situations. So that's something that we continue to evaluate. We have, again, excellent working relationship with our law enforcement partners, and it's a very strong unit that unfortunately we're going to have to maintain as long as we're experiencing this problem.
So we wanted to share, a little bit about our community coalition, but also introduce, if you have not heard about our CU Fresh Start initiative, our approach community-wide to address our gun violence issue. So I think we're going to have an opportunity for question and answer a little later, but we wanted to introduce those things to you.
And now we will hear from Dr. Ellie Hanover with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense about her organization and what they are doing. If you're interested in her organization afterwards, there are sign-up sheets in the back.
Okay, let's see.
We're all technical today.
Yeah. And I am the worst one to be involved in the technology.
Okay, so I am going to back us up a little bit to look at the issue of gun violence at the national level before I take us back to the very local level that my colleagues here have been discussing. As you were saying, when you cross Wright Street, it doesn't matter. And to that point, we're part of a larger community that is affected by gun violence throughout the state and the nation. So I wanted to just start by sharing a few facts with you that I find to be shocking. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the organization that I represent. I am a volunteer, I should say, and this is not my day job. And just on a personal note, what brought me to volunteer with this organization is when I think this is an issue that affects a lot of people in this country. I'm lucky enough not to be one of the thousands of survivors of gun violence who's lost a family member or a close friend to the crisis, but I did, when I was in 9th grade in high school, there was a boy in my class who was accidentally shot to death by his best friend when they were playing with the friend's father's gun in their home that was not obviously secured from access by children. And this is a problem that we unfortunately hear about on the news all too often these days. So that was something that stuck with me. And so that's what brings me here today. So we definitely have a crisis in terms of gun violence in this country. A lot of us in the gun violence prevention movement really like to look at this as a public health issue. If this many people were being killed by a disease, we would be taking a lot more action than we are taking at the national level on this issue. So we lose over 35,000 Americans every year. And just to bring that down to the local level, obviously we hear about Chicago a lot in the news. We lost 764 people, and those were murders in Chicago last year. And I believe we've lost 3 people here in Champaign and 2 in Urbana so far in 2017. To put that in perspective, this is an American problem. If you look at our rates of gun violence and gun deaths compared to other comparable nations around the world, we're off the charts. And obviously this is an issue that's very wrapped up with other societal issues, whether it be poverty or race, economics, employment. Those issues exist in other countries as well, but they don't have the same problems with gun violence that we do. One of the aspects of gun violence in this nation that's often overlooked by the nightly news, for example, is that actually the majority of gun deaths in this country are suicides. And a gun in the home will triple the risk that somebody in that house ends up committing suicide with a gun. The issue there is that you're very successful when you use a gun. So this statistic illustrates that people who attempt suicide by other means, only 10% of them actually succeed. Those numbers are flipped when a gun is involved. 90% of people who attempt suicide with a gun succeed, if I can use that word. Domestic violence is another topic where gun violence is very prevalent. And one point that I think stands out is, everybody hears about the mass shootings, the school shootings. Those are actually a small percentage of shootings nationwide, but it is interesting to note that the majority of those mass shootings actually started as domestic violence issues or incidents, and that women in this country are much more likely to be killed with guns by an intimate partner or a family member. So I think this issue has gotten a lot of national attention since, in particular, since the shooting in Newtown, Connecticut at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And this is just, I think, an appalling statistic that you would not see anywhere else, and that is the number of school shootings just since 2013. And obviously that you can get statistics going back to Columbine a little bit further. But again, a lot of these, if you look at how the student, or and sometimes it was an adult who perpetrated these incidents, most of those guns were taken from a family member in the home. The gun was not secured. So it was the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting that was the impetus for the creation of the organization Moms Demand Action. We were started by a stay-at-home mom of 5, Shannon Watts. The day after Sandy Hook, she was watching the news, was horrified, went on Facebook. She had, I think, 75 friends at the time. And she just felt like she had to do something, and that she, wanted to do something. And very quickly, she had thousands of people all over the country contacting her, saying, I feel the same way, I want to get involved. So just since, in those past few years, the organization has grown exponentially. We are a nonpartisan grassroots organization. And our main goal is really to advocate for stronger laws and policies that will reduce these horrifying statistics, reduce gun violence, and promote gun safety. We fully support the Second Amendment as an organization. We think that there's so much that can be done to create a safer environment. So the organization is very much modeled on the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, which similarly was started by a mother who thought this is insane. You know, people should not be dying in these high numbers. And as a result, we have seatbelt laws, excuse me. So it's very much along those lines. Guns can be safely stored. Laws can be passed that keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers, criminals, etc. So as we grew as an organization, we actually became part of a larger umbrella organization called Everytown For Gun Safety. And Everytown is now an umbrella that includes Moms Demand Action. Moms Demand Action is really the grassroots organizing arm. So we are the volunteers on the ground. We have chapters in all 50 states now. And so here in Illinois, for example, I think we have about 14,000 members across the state. And we have local groups all over. So we have many local groups in the Chicagoland area. The group here in Champaign-Urbana started in fall of 2015. A local mother, Lauren Quinn, founded our local group here. And we now have about, I would say about 250 members just in the Champaign-Urbana area. We have groups in Southern Illinois as well, and a new group just started in Danville, which, as you may have been reading about, has faced an extremely high level of gun violence this past year. So we are part of this larger organization that also grew out of a group called Mayors Against Illegal Guns. So we do work very closely with local legislators, state legislators, federal legislators, law enforcement. And we also have made a point to bring in the voices of survivors of gun violence into the movement. So some of you may have seen our main spokeswoman, Lucy McBath, speak, and she is a representative of our Everytown Survivor Network. Her son, Jordan Davis, was shot to death in Florida for playing loud music in his car. And somebody came along to the gas station and didn't like the loud music and shot him to death. And that was her only child. So she has become an amazing spokeswoman. And we have, actually, I should mention, a fellow, Everytown Survivor fellow right here in Champaign-Urbana who's very involved in all of these issues, who's Patricia Avery. So this is something, and I'll speak more in a minute, that we're trying to do more of at the local level, is really to engage survivors here in town and provide them with resources and support. So as an organization, we have 4 main goals, and those are to close the loopholes in our background check system that allow people who should not have easy access to guns to access guns, to promote gun safety so we don't see the statistics that we see of the number of toddlers shooting themselves by accident. And we really support what we consider to be reasonable limits on where, when, and how loaded guns are carried and legally carried in public. And to that end, we also are working to address gun trafficking issues and fraudulent purchasing. So I just want to touch on each of these briefly. There's a federal background check system, but there's a big loophole. And that is private sales and gun show sales. And so many people are able to purchase a gun without going through a criminal background check. And just to give a few more statistics on that, in states like Illinois, where we do go beyond the federal law and require background checks on all handgun sales, you can see the difference. And in terms of fewer women shot to death by intimate partners, fewer suicides by gun, and fewer law enforcement officers shot and killed in the line of duty. So our Our second goal is, again, gun safety, and we have an gun safety education program that we provide to anybody who's interested in the community. It's called Be Smart, and this is primarily aimed at parents, both gun owners and non-gun owners. And it's really just, it's a presentation that we give, and we have volunteers here in town who are trained to give these presentations, whether it be at a PTA meeting, a church group, wherever there's interest. And it's basically just straightforward, common sense information on how to keep your guns, if you have a gun in the home, how to keep it secure, keep it away from children, and how to really look for and recognize risks in advance of incidents of suicidal tendencies and the like, especially among teenagers. And then for those parents who are not gun owners as well, to think about when you send your child for a play date at somebody else's house, to ask, is there a gun in the home? Is it properly stored? Because nobody wants to be in the position of a child not coming home from a play date. So we also advocate for reasonable limits on guns in public places. And one of the biggest issues here is gun-free zones and guns in schools. So ever since the Virginia Tech shooting, which was back in 2008, the NRA has been pushing to allow guns on college campuses. This is unsurprisingly opposed by most college faculty, presidents, and students. But nevertheless, there are strong pushes to allow guns in not only college campuses, but K-12 schools, which are now protected as gun-free school zones, stadiums, bars, because nothing makes more sense than drinking and deadly weapons, as well as government buildings. So just to give you a brief snapshot, since we're in a college town here, you can see how just over the last few years, these states have been forced to allow guns on their campuses. So that means there are some states where, like Illinois, where concealed carry is legal, but the law is written so that a university can say, okay, but we don't want to allow, guns on our campus. In these states, the law is written so that the president of the university has no option. If it's the law in the state, it's the law on campus. And as you can see, these are recent, very recent laws. Yes, I believe so. Yeah, Texas. Yes. So these are the types of laws that Moms Demand Action volunteers are fighting in these states as they come up. We spend a lot of time, I'm not wearing my shirt today, Jenny is wearing one of our shirts, but our volunteers spend a lot of time in state houses during legislative sessions when these bills come up, speaking to lawmakers, trying to explain that we do not want guns in our children's classrooms or in our workplaces. And then last but not least, and this is an issue that comes up a lot for Illinois and specifically the Chicago area, is gun trafficking. The issue of gun violence is not, you can't set a law in one community or one state and not be affected by the laws surrounding you. And people like to point to Chicago a lot and say, look at the horrible problem. I guess Illinois' strict gun laws aren't working. Well, most of the crime guns used in Chicago come from out of state, and they are trafficked illegally into Chicago. And that is because our neighbors, Indiana, Missouri, do not have the same laws that we do. So what we're doing here at the local level, as I mentioned, we started here in Champaign-Urbana about 2 years ago. We've been privileged to be in attendance at these community coalition meetings, and we have been doing our best to get involved as much as we can with the really, really wonderful initiatives like CU Fresh Start that are taking place in our community. And when I speak with volunteers from our organization from all over the country and we tell them about the Community Coalition and See You Fresh Start, we get these looks like, wow, I wish we could get something like that going in our community. So I know that we are very fortunate here, and I think the size of our community is helpful to that end as well. But what we are doing is we are organizing locally and taking some of these national campaigns to the local level. So as I mentioned, we have some of our volunteers who are trained to give these Be Smart gun safety education presentations. You will see us all over town. We have tables at the farmers market, at CU days. There's a lot of tables over the summer. And at the Community Coalition meetings, we're available to give these presentations. If anybody is interested, there's an email address here, but you can also talk to me afterwards. I think next month, I'm excited, we're going to be presenting to a group of pediatricians at Carl. It seems that when you take a newborn or any child in to see the doctor, they ask you if you have a car seat. They should also ask you if there's a gun in the home and is it stored safely so that your child is safe. We really believe that the responsibility lies with the adult to keep the child safe and not the child. So you can tell your child, don't touch a gun if you see it. What's the child going to do? They're going to touch the gun. So we are also organizing, not sure what happened to my photo here, but okay. Organizing right now, in terms of legislation, we are most concerned with two pieces of legislation at the federal level, but these have a huge impact on us here in Illinois. One of these is called Concealed Carry Reciprocity, which is moving its way through the House and the Senate right now. And this would essentially take every state's gun laws down to the lowest common denominator in terms of concealed carry laws. So here in Illinois, if you want to have a concealed carry permit, you need to go through 16 hours of training, including live fire training, and correct me if I'm getting anything wrong here. You need to obviously go through a background check. You can't have certain things in your criminal record, be a domestic abuser. These are part of the law. In Missouri right now, there is permitless carry. So not only do you not need to go through a background check, you don't need to go through any sort of training, nothing. And you are legally allowed to carry concealed loaded weapons in public. So this would essentially pull us all in every state down to that standard. More recently, we are fighting something called the SHARE Act, which is currently in Congress, and this would remove silencers, or otherwise known as suppressors, from the National Firearms Act, essentially making them extremely easy to access, whereas they are rather difficult to access right now. And again, we don't think that silencers are something that needs to be in the hands of everyday citizens. I would imagine it would make law enforcement's job extremely difficult if you can't hear the gunshots. There's actually software being used by law enforcement in certain cities, something called Shot Spotter, I believe. It's an app. It's able to trace gunshots, and you can only imagine if the criminals have the silencers, then we're in trouble. So we're calling our representatives. We're showing up at their offices. And sorry, this is a little bit more on the silencers. And we're trying to get as many people to speak up as possible about these issues and how they would affect us. We just, in August, we're running a postcard campaign, which is still going, and I have some in the back, asking our our representatives to oppose concealed carry reciprocity. Unfortunately, Rodney Davis is a co-sponsor of the bill. So we've, and actually so is Shimkus, so is LaHood, and who am I forgetting? There are 4 or 5 co-sponsors of the bill from Illinois. So we paid all but 2 of our Illinois representatives visits during the August recess to let them know how we feel about this. Some of them are very supportive, some of them aren't, as you can imagine. And it's going to come back in the House this fall, so we're just continuing to make our voices heard. We also have a campaign for educators, and that's at the K-12 and the university level. And I'm happy to give you more information later. And we're just trying to mobilize educators and people who work in schools so that when these bills come up, you have the information, you can call your reps and say, as a teacher, I do not want to be law enforcement. That's not my job. So these are just a few of the partners and events and types of activities we have going on here locally. As I mentioned, we've been privileged to be part of the Community Coalition meetings. We've also been working with the Public Health Department. And obviously we're here today with the League of Women Voters. CU Area Project, which is Patricia Avery's organization, has a project called Truce, working right now where they're also trying to, stop some of these. Am I out of time?
Yeah, I think we'd probably better move on.
I'm good. I'm done. I would just invite you to join us at some of our upcoming events. We have a spa day for survivors of gun violence coming up on September 30th. And we'll also be out with Courage Connection on October 7th. And our next meeting is October 10th. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open it up to audience questions. Does anyone have a question for our panelists today?
As you have worked with these young people who, Mr. Parsons is who I'm addressing, who have committed felonious acts apparently, what have you discovered to be the main, the core reason for this kind of violence? Is it drugs? Is it, what do you call them? The groups, the gangs, that's the word, yes. Yeah. Are individual problems that have just overwhelmed them? What have you found out?
So what a great question. Also should share that we've been collecting data. We have researchers working with us around this work and gathering a lot of data about such things. So what the Don't Shoot book would say, and I think we find very similar things here locally, we don't have, and Joe, please correct me, we don't have really the traditional gang problem as other communities might have. These guys associate with what Chief Cobb would say to me are cliques, groups that they hang out with. But surprisingly, and I'm not saying drugs and money aren't part of it either, but it really is more even simple, stupid things. So these guys have problems with decision making and how to handle conflict and things of that nature. So it's often around street credibility issues, personal slights. You said something bad to me, you approached my girlfriend. They have not learned about how to handle conflict. And so I think we find some similar things here locally, that it's often, the simplest thing that these guys are not able to handle conflict. And I think, as we've heard here, because the guns are so accessible, they solve their conflict by shooting one another versus talking it out and those types of things.
We're really low on time, but do I have one more question from the floor?
So I'm just curious about the source of the guns. We can do all these things to regulate guns by permits and so on, but what do you think the percentage of illegal weapons are floating around there in the ether that, you know, and how have they gotten to these young folks?
Well, I don't have any numbers or statistics that I can share with you on that figure, but what I can say is the overwhelming majority of guns that are used in these shootings are not possessed legally. They're not, you know, the individuals do not have concealed carry or FOID cards. So there's several issues going on just besides how they're getting the guns. They're possessing them illegally and not obtaining them through local purchase.
That's one of the things we need to learn about is where are all these guns coming from? How are they getting to our communities? And we do know that there's been some burglaries and thefts. So as Joe talked about, burglary, you know, being a huge thing.
Yeah, we certainly see, you know, thefts of guns, whether it's a residential burglary or vehicle burglary, and that's why, you know, we're really trying to address property crimes right now. But, you know, you could have, you know, a friend or relative purchase the gun legally and then they sell it to an individual, or it gets stolen from that individual. So there's just a number of different manners in which these guns are obtained, but all of which are illegal.
Okay. I want to thank all my panelists. You've had a lot to say. And if you're interested in following up, I know the CU Coalition, you said the meeting is every second Wednesday.
Second Wednesday of the month, 3:30 at Champaign Public Library.
All right. And Ellie, when are your open meetings?
We're once a month, and our next one is October 10th, and we're going to be meeting at BTW Elementary School.
Okay. And of course, League of Women Voters, we will be holding a few additional follow-on meetings on other aspects of the very complicated gun situation in this country. And you can look to see more about those on the email blasts or on our webpage coming. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks our panel. Can everybody give a round of applause?